On the night he thought the family would gather in peace, Dan's own son rose to deliver a blow sharper than any knife. The smell of roasted chicken and jollof rice filled the air, but under it lingered something darker: betrayal. Michael, his eldest, lifted his glass, his voice steady yet cold. "Dad, we've talked and we've decided. You are no longer part of this family. Leave this house tonight." Gasps swept through the dining table. Emily, Michael's wife, sat with a faint smile tugging at her lips, as though she had been waiting for this moment. Dan didn't flinch. He reached under his chair, pulled out a thick brown folder, and slid it across the table. "A parting gift for you, son," he said quietly. Michael took it, and as he opened it, his face drained of color. The air was still, as though the whole room had stopped breathing. "Where are you watching from today? Kindly hit like, comment, and subscribe to this channel for more." The laughter and clinking of cutlery from moments ago were gone, replaced by an uneasy silence. The heavy mahogany table, once a symbol of family unity, now felt like the battleground for their deepest rift. Dan's eyes didn't leave Michael's as the first page in the folder revealed its sting: an eviction notice with his name and Emily's printed in bold. Around them, relatives exchanged shocked glances, unsure whether to speak or keep silent. Earlier that week, Dan had sensed this storm brewing. The house in a J town had been his pride, built with his own hands over 35 years, brick by brick, after long shifts as an engineer at Sunwave Holdings. But recently Michael and Emily had been pressing him to modernize the home. They wanted new imported tiles, luxury furniture, and appliances that cost more than a year's school fees. To Dan, it wasn't about comfort. It was about erasing history, erasing the life he and his late wife Grace had built together. He had said no. They had taken it as a challenge. The folder on the table wasn't just a document. It was a blade Dan had sharpened in secret. Inside were court orders freezing Michael and Emily's accounts, a list of their unpaid debts, and transcripts of their own recorded conversations plotting to push him out of his home. Dan had spent weeks gathering the evidence, meeting with lawyers at Citibank's legal offices, and making sure every page was ironclad. This wasn't an outburst. This was strategy. Michael's hands shook as he flipped through the pages. You can't do this," he stammered, his voice breaking for the first time that evening. Emily reached for the folder, her eyes scanning the evidence, her confident smile crumbling. "This is all lies," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Around the table, murmurs rose. Uncles, aunts, cousins all reading the papers passed from hand to hand. Linda, Dan's younger sister, fixed Michael with a glare. "You told us he was losing his mind. But these papers say you tried to sell his house." Michael's lips moved, but no excuse came. Dan leaned back in his chair, his face calm, the years of hurt in his heart replaced with one quiet thought. The trap they set for him had just snapped shut on them instead. The clinking of glasses had stopped. The aroma of roasted chicken now felt heavy, like it was sinking into the walls along with the shame in the air. Dan's eyes moved slowly across the table, taking in the faces of family who had once looked at him with respect. Now some could not meet his gaze. Others leaned forward, hungry for the next words, as though the truth unfolding was sweeter than the meal before them. He had expected resistance. He had not expected the silence to cut deeper than any argument. Michael tried to gather the scattered papers, but Linda's hand was firm on the table. "Leave them," she said sharply, her voice echoing through the room. The boldness in her tone stirred whispers among the guests. Emily, flustered, tried to regain her composure, but her voice wavered. "This isn't what you think. We only wanted what's best for him." Dan's lips curled in a faint, humorless smile. "What's best for me," he repeated slowly, "was never in your plans. You only wanted what was best for yourselves." In the weeks before this night, Dan had walked the dusty streets of a J town in quiet thought. Each evening, he would sit on the wooden bench under the mango tree in front of his home, listening to the laughter of neighborhood children and the hum of distant generators. He thought about Grace, about her dream of filling this house with love that would last generations. And he thought about how Michael's greed, sharpened by Emily's ambitions, had turned that dream into a target. The bench became his war room, and under its shade, he plotted how to fight back. His first step had been to visit Citibank, where his old friend John now worked as a legal consultant. Over cups of steaming black tea, Dan had laid out the story, each detail like a brick in the wall he was building against his enemies. John had listened quietly, occasionally jotting notes. By the time they finished, they had a plan: airtight documents, account freezes, and legal control over the property. "Once this is signed, they can't touch it," John had said, sliding a pen across the desk. Dan had signed without hesitation. Now, watching Michael's face twist between anger and fear, Dan knew every late-night meeting, every dusty walk to the bank, had been worth it. The whispers in the dining room grew into open chatter as more guests read the evidence. "So this is the truth," someone muttered. "They wanted to throw him out." Michael slammed his hand on the table, the plates rattling. "Enough. This is our family matter. Everyone out." But no one moved. They weren't going anywhere. Not while the truth was spilling out like water from a broken clay pot. Emily's voice rose, sharp as a blade. "Dan, you're embarrassing yourself in front of everyone." She tried to gather the papers again, but Linda blocked her hand with a firm slap on the table. "No, Emily. The embarrassment is yours." Gasps circled the room. Even the younger cousins, who had been whispering in the corner, now leaned in to listen. Dan stayed quiet, letting the moment breathe. He knew silence could be as powerful as speech when the truth was already laid bare. The heavy curtains swayed gently in the evening breeze, but the room felt hot. Michael stood frozen, his jaw tight, his hands balled into fists. "You've ruined Christmas," he muttered. Dan's eyes didn't move from him. "Christmas," he said, his tone calm but cutting. "You tried to ruin my life, my home, and the memory of your mother. And you think this is about Christmas dinner?" A murmur of agreement spread across the table. In that moment, the tide of sympathy shifted firmly toward Dan. He thought back to the night he first overheard their plan. Michael and Emily had been in the living room, speaking in low tones, unaware Dan was standing in the hallway. "We'll tell everyone he's too old to manage the house," Emily had whispered. "We'll get legal control, sell it, and move somewhere modern." Michael had agreed without hesitation. That night, Dan had gone to bed with a decision forming like a storm in his chest. He would not confront them then. He would wait, prepare, and strike when they least expected. Rose slowly, pushing his chair back with deliberate weight. "This house was built with my sweat," he began, his voice steady. "Every brick laid while I worked 2 shifts, every nail hammered with a dream. And yet, my own son plotted to take it away." His words fell heavy, like stones in a quiet river. No one dared interrupt. Michael's face was pale now. He reached for Emily's hand under the table, but she pulled hers away, her eyes darting nervously toward the guests. "We can still fix this, Dad," Michael said, his voice cracking. Dan shook his head slowly. "You don't fix a tree by cutting its roots," he replied. The elders at the table exchanged knowing looks. They had heard such wisdom before, passed down from their fathers. Outside, the faint sound of distant drumming drifted in from the neighborhood. It was a wedding celebration somewhere nearby, but inside this house, the only music was the steady beat of tension. Dan leaned on the table with both hands. "This is not just about money," he said. "It's about respect. It's about family. And you, Michael, you broke both." His voice trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of years spent sacrificing for a son who now stood against him. Linda stood, holding up a page from the folder, the transcript of Michael and Emily's recorded conversation. "Did you or did you not say these words?" she demanded. Michael's lips parted, but no sound came. Emily tried to speak, but the room erupted in shouts. "Shame!" one uncle called out. "Greed!" another muttered. Dan didn't need to add more. The crowd was doing his work for him now. The truth had a way of spreading quickly, like fire on dry grass. A few guests quietly picked up their coats, shaking their heads as they prepared to leave. Others stayed, perhaps curious to see the final blow. Michael's eyes were wild now, darting from face to face, searching for an ally. But even his closest cousin avoided his gaze. Emily's mascara had begun to smudge, her calm unraveling in front of everyone. Dan reached for the last page in the folder, the signed legal notice putting the house into a trust under his sole control. He placed it in the center of the table. "Even if I leave tomorrow, this house will never belong to either of you," he said. The sentence landed like a hammer. Emily slumped back in her chair, her eyes fixed on the paper as if it were a prison gate closing. For a long moment no one spoke. Then Dan straightened, his eyes sweeping across the room. "Family is built on trust," he said. "And once you sell that trust for greed, you can't buy it back, not with all the dollars in the world." He turned, walking toward the doorway. Behind him, Michael's voice cracked into a plea, but Dan didn't stop. He had won the battle without shouting, without threats, only with truth, preparation, and the weight of his own dignity. The hallway felt cooler than the dining room, the air carrying the faint scent of pine from the Christmas tree. Dan's footsteps were steady, each one a quiet declaration that he was in control. Behind him, voices overlapped, some in hushed tones, others sharp with disbelief. He paused by the family photographs on the wall. One showed Michael as a boy, grinning with missing teeth while holding a homemade kite. Dan's chest tightened. That boy was gone, replaced by a man who had traded love for greed. He stepped outside to the veranda, where the night air wrapped around him like an old friend. From here he could hear the muffled voices inside, Emily trying to calm Michael, Michael snapping back. The neighborhood was alive with distant music and the occasional bark of a dog, but Dan felt a peace he hadn't known in months. The stars above a J town seemed brighter tonight, as though they had been waiting for this moment of truth. Inside, the guests began to leave. Some shook their heads, muttering about how shame could hide in plain sight until the right light revealed it. Linda came to the veranda, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. "You did well," she said softly. Dan nodded but said nothing. His victories had never been about gloating. They were about restoring balance, about reminding people that respect is earned, not stolen. He thought back to Grace, the woman who had walked beside him for 33 years before illness took her. She had been the heart of the home, the one who could turn a simple pot of beans into a feast and a troubled day into an evening of laughter. She had always believed Michael would carry the family's name with pride. Dan wished she hadn't lived to see how wrong that belief would have been. Later that night, when the guests were gone, Michael came to the veranda. His face was drawn, his voice low. "Dad, we made a mistake." Dan turned to him slowly, his gaze steady. "A mistake is forgetting to lock the gate at night. What you did was a choice." Michael's lips trembled, but he said nothing more. He turned and went back inside, the sound of the door closing behind him like the final chapter of a book. The next morning, Dan visited Citibank to hand John the final signed documents. "It's done," John said after glancing at them. "They can't touch the house, and the eviction notice stands. You've got the law on your side now." Dan gave a small nod. "It's not about throwing them out, John. It's about making sure they can't destroy what I've built." John smiled faintly, spoken like a man who knows his foundation is stronger than any storm. Back in a J town, word of what had happened spread quickly. At the corner barber shop, men debated whether Michael's betrayal was worse than Emily's scheming. In the market, women shook their heads, saying, "It's the ones you raise that can break you the hardest." Dan didn't mind the talk. In fact, he welcomed it. Sometimes, a story had to travel far and wide so others could learn the lesson without living the pain. A week later, Michael and Emily received the formal eviction notice from the court. Emily was furious, throwing the envelope onto the floor. "We'll fight it," she told Michael. But when they visited a lawyer in the city, he only shook his head after reading the documents. "Your father's case is airtight," he said. "You have no grounds to stay." That night, Emily packed her clothes in silence. Michael sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall. Dan didn't attend the day they left. Instead, he sat under the mango tree, sipping tea and listening to the rustle of leaves. A neighbor passed by and said, "So they're gone?" Dan nodded. "Yes, but the wound they left will take longer to heal." The neighbor offered a sympathetic smile before walking on. Dan knew healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about choosing not to carry the weight any longer than necessary. That evening, Dan walked through the quiet rooms of his house. Without Michael and Emily's tension, the air felt lighter, freer. He stopped in the dining room, running his hand over the polished surface of the table where the battle had been fought and won. In the stillness, he whispered to Grace's memory, "It's safe now." Outside, the moon hung low over a J town, casting silver light over the home that had survived not just the years, but the storms within its own walls. Days turned into weeks, and the house began to feel alive again. Dan opened the windows each morning, letting in the fresh breeze that carried the scent of blooming hibiscus from the garden. He repaired a loose hinge on the kitchen door, fixed the squeaky floorboard in the hallway, and even repainted the veranda railings. It was more than maintenance, it was a reclaiming. Every nail and brushstroke felt like a promise to himself. This home would remain in the hands of someone who valued it. One Sunday afternoon, Linda stopped by with a pot of pepper soup and a warm smile. They sat in the living room, sipping slowly, the steam rising between them. "People in town are still talking," she said. "They can't believe Michael would do that to you." Dan stirred his soup gently. "Let them talk. It's better they learn the story than repeat the mistake." Linda nodded, her eyes full of pride. "You've turned a wound into a warning for others." At the community center in a J town, the elders invited Dan to speak during their monthly meeting. Standing under the shade of the giant Iroko tree, he told the story without bitterness, focusing instead on the lesson. "A house is more than bricks," he said. "It's built on trust. If trust is sold, even for a mountain of gold, the roof will still collapse." The crowd murmured in agreement, and a few young men in the back exchanged thoughtful glances. That evening, as he walked home, Dan passed the old football field where Michael had once played as a boy. The memory came uninvited. Michael's gap-toothed smile, running toward him after scoring a goal, shouting, "Did you see that, Dad?" Dan's chest tightened, but he let the memory fade. Some things could be remembered without being relived. One morning a letter arrived from Michael. The handwriting was uneven, the envelope smudged. Dan set it on the table and stared at it for a long moment before opening it. Inside were a few short lines. "I'm sorry, Dad. We were wrong. I hope one day we can talk again." Dan read it twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in a drawer. Forgiveness, he knew, was a door he could choose to open, but not today. The holidays came and went. Dan spent them quietly, inviting a few neighbors for dinner and giving small gifts to the children in the street. The laughter in his home was softer now, but it was genuine. No hidden agendas, no false smiles. The mahogany table, once a place of tension, now hosted warm meals shared with those who truly wished him well. He began to notice things he hadn't before. The way the morning light hit the wall in the hallway, the comforting creak of the wooden stairs, the smell of rain on the tin roof. These small details reminded him that life's joy often hides in moments too quiet for the greedy to notice. In these moments, Dan felt the kind of peace that money couldn't buy. One afternoon, Sarah, Grace's oldest friend, came to visit. She had been the one to warn him about Michael and Emily's plan before the Christmas dinner. They sat on the veranda, sipping Zobo, watching the children play in the street. "I knew you'd handle it," Sarah said with a chuckle. "But I didn't think you'd handle it this well." Dan smiled. "When you build your life brick by brick, you learn how to take it back the same way." News eventually reached Dan that Michael and Emily had moved to another town, renting a small apartment near the city. Some said they were struggling. Others claimed they were doing fine. Dan neither wished them harm nor rushed to help. "They have their road, I have mine," he told Linda when she asked. If our paths cross again, let it be in peace, not conflict. That night, under the quiet hum of the ceiling fan, Dan wrote in his journal, a habit Grace had always encouraged. He wrote about loss and renewal, about the danger of unchecked greed, and about the strength that comes from preparation. Closing the book, he whispered to himself, some storms come to destroy, others come to clear the path. Outside, the moon bathed a jay town in silver, and in that calm light, Dan knew the path ahead was his alone to walk, and he was ready. Weeks later, Dan received an invitation from the local youth association to speak at their annual gathering. He hesitated at first but eventually agreed. On the day of the event, he stood before the young men and women, the open-air hall buzzing with energy. The greatest danger, he told them, is not what strangers might take from you, but what family might take when they forget the meaning of family. His words landed heavily, and a deep silence followed. After his talk, several young people approached him. Some shared their own stories of betrayal. Others simply thanked him for speaking openly. Dan left the hall feeling lighter. His pain had been turned into a lesson, one that might save someone else from walking blindly into the kind of trap Michael and Emily had set for him. In that there was a quiet victory. The days grew warmer as the harmattan season passed. Dan tended to his garden more often, planting new cassava stalks and trimming the mango tree. One afternoon, he spotted a neighborhood boy trying to fix a broken bicycle chain. Without a second thought, Dan fetched his tools and knelt beside him. As they worked together, the boy smiled shyly and said, "You remind me of my grandfather." Dan chuckled softly. "That's the best thing I've heard all week." One evening, Sarah visited again, bringing with her an old photograph of Grace. The edges were worn, but the image was clear. Grace standing in front of the house, her smile brighter than the sun. Dan held the picture for a long time. "She'd be proud of you," Sarah said. Dan didn't answer, but his eyes glistened. In his heart, he hoped it was true. A few days later, Dan sat at his desk, writing a letter. This one was not to Michael, but to himself, a letter of gratitude. He listed the people who had stood by him, the wisdom he had gained, and the peace he had reclaimed. When he finished, he folded it and tucked it into the same drawer where Michael's apology letter rested. Both letters, in different ways, marked turning points in his life. The trust he had placed on the house gave him more than security. It gave him freedom. He began hosting small gatherings again, inviting neighbors for palm wine and roasted plantain. Laughter returned to the veranda, mixing with the warm evening breeze. The house no longer felt like a fortress against betrayal. It felt like a home again. One Sunday morning, as church bells rang across a jay town, Dan stood on his veranda watching children in bright clothes walk with their parents. Life, he thought, had a way of moving on whether you were ready or not. The hurt would always be a scar, but scars were proof that wounds could heal. In the market that week, a woman approached him. "Are you the man whose son tried to take his house?" she asked. Dan nodded cautiously. She smiled. "I told my children that story. I told them to always respect the hands that fed them." Dan thanked her, realizing the story had already traveled far beyond his street. That night, he sat under the mango tree, sipping tea and listening to the crickets sing. The air was cool, and the moon hung low over a jay town. For the first time in a long while, he felt no lingering anger toward Michael or Emily. They had chosen their road. He had chosen his. And his road was leading him toward peace. As the breeze rustled the leaves above, Dan whispered a quiet prayer of thanks, for the home that still stood, for the friends who stood by him, and for the strength to walk through the fire without losing himself. "Some storms clear the path," he murmured again, smiling into the night. And in that moment, under the calm African sky, Dan knew the story of his betrayal was no longer a wound. It was a lesson, sealed in wisdom, ready to be passed on for generations to come.